Hello there, my name is Noah Giberson, and I'm here alongside my co-hosts Em.
Hi.
And Rob.
Hi there.
We are the hosts of Fax Machine, a podcast by and for people who are curious about everything, but especially the things that make them laugh. And today, I am very pleased to welcome our special guest, Kristina Parsons.
Hello.
Welcome, Kristina. We are so excited that you're here joining us. Kristina is a museum curator and design enthusiast who has worked at Cooper Hewitt and MoMA and currently curates at the Jewish Museum in New York City. Welcome, Kristina. How are you doing?
I'm really good. I'm so happy to be with you all. Thanks for having me.
So, Kristina, in addition to your life in, the museum world and in curation, I hear that you are also a former very talented swimmer. I'm sure that you're still very talented at swimming. I just mean to imply that we have another very talented swimmer who is washed up. In Rob Frawley.
We have a very technical term for these people. We call them swammers.
Nice. It's a very exclusive club.
So how do you feel like your life as a competitive swimmer prepared you for the cutthroat world of museum curation?
Oh, yes. Well, everything is a race. Everything is a competition. Even though swimming is an individual sport, technically you're supposed to work in a team. So I try to do that every once in a while. It's a great occupation for people who don't like being in front of people. You can spend a lot of time with books, researching. You do a lot of writing. You do a lot of thinking. And then if you're organizing an exhibition, then there's a big push of doing all of the practical, non-theory stuff where it's like, well, that's not going to fit in a museum, or that lives somewhere else, and you have to figure out how to get it here. And so there's a bit of the push of the practical side. But mostly you just get to live in your own thoughts and live in theory land, which is a nice utopian place to live.
I just find it so cool, the things that are curated. I think people have an idea of an art museum or a design museum, what goes inside. And it's just can you give us a quick spectral range of what are all the things that you've curated or seen? What topics do you cover that people wouldn't expect in a museum?
That was just a clip from An Engineer Asks What a Museum Is Like. Can we get a spectral analysis?
Central casting, can we send in? I would say that most of the work that I do in the museums that I've been working in take a specific object. So it can be a work of art, or it could be something that's part of our everyday, kind of an object of popular culture, and uses that as a launching point to start a conversation. So if you think of that individual object as one node, then a curator's job in some way is to think about all of the different nodes that can come together to create a larger conversation, space for larger reflection. You have ways of then researching those to create connections between the two that maybe unveil something about the world around us that people hadn't considered in that way before. So it can be kind of methodical in that way. But there's, of course, I think the great thing is that there's a lot of room for other people to layer in their own life experiences when they come in. So the museum can present something to you and it has maybe a certain cachet because it's within the walls of an institution. But everyone that comes in and sees something and interacts with it comes with their own life experience, their own perspective, their own biases. And so they're then able to kind of layer in another part of the story of that object and the way that it exists in our society.
That's very interesting, and I'm really eager to get your perspective on what we do in Fax Machine, which is here's something we're like, that's silly. People did that? And then we kind of explore it more. So I'm eager for this masterclass in our own podcast.
Yeah, it's storytelling, right? And figuring out how people build worlds around them and engage in different perspectives and think through what reality is. I mean, you can be very existential or you could be very practical.
Well, on that note, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to try to achieve that today. In every episode of Facts Machine, each of us shares one fascinating fact, along with the incredible story behind it. And finally, we wrap things up with a pub-style trivia quiz loosely inspired by the theme. This week, our theme is World's Fairs.
Woo!
You may have seen them depicted in various media, usually a long time ago. It doesn't really feel like the kind of thing that happens all the time, but they do happen now, even today.
Still, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised.
Often referred to as like Expo or like World Expos, but I feel like my internal representation of a World's Fair is like, step right up to the amazing thing. Like, the never before seen, I don't know, gramophone. Yeah.
No, you're encroaching on my intellectual property with
I
your old-timey
know.
voice.
Okay, and with that, Em, take it away.
Thanks very much. So this week I learned that the Tempest Prognosticator, which is what it sounds like, but in a very unexpected way, debuted at the first ever World's Fair, London's Great Exhibition of 1851. So, the Great Exhibition, which was short for the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, was held in Hyde Park in London over 5 months in 1851. And
In 1851, Britain had basically conquered all the nations, too. So it was really just one nation and then Britain's aspirations.
Yes.
They're like PS Empire.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly. So, yeah, it basically happened because Queen Victoria wanted to just, like, flex the British Empire. It was very focused on British technology and manufacturing and culture, but also featured lots of raw materials and handicrafts from various British colonies. So, as you just mentioned, it was, in a way, a World's Fair, but just, like, you know, the sun never sets in the British world at the time, so...
Yeah.
That was the World's Fair. But like all the World's Fairs that came after it, it did feature a lot of exhibits, including, as far as I could tell, a lot of big-ass diamonds. Like, people were just very into showing off gigantic diamonds back then. Also, the first ever pay toilets, which were not technically an exhibit, but I would consider them an interactive exhibit. An early prototype of the fax machine.
Yeah.
Which also... Another prototype was debuted at a subsequent World's Fair, and I actually spent some time trying to, like, make this fact/story about fax machines, but as a deterrent, it's really boring. Just don't try it. Like, I really wanted to wrangle a fax machine story, and it was like, this should not happen.
Note to
for everyone's
listeners,
benefit.
fax machines are boring.
Yes. They invented it. We perfected it.
Right.
And another exhibition was this instrument called the Tempest Prognosticator. So it was invented by a doctor and inventor named George Merriweather, right? Already off to a good start. And as a doctor in the 19th century, he kept leeches as part of his medical practice, and he noticed that they seemed to get kind of like agitated during certain atmospheric conditions. So, as an inventor in the 19th century, he thought, I should make a weather predictor using leeches, because that was just what you did back then. So he enlisted the help of some local craftsmen and built the Tempest Prognosticator, which, if you picture it, looked like a little carousel, but stationary, with a bunch of bells on top, and then at the bottom, instead of ponies, just bottles of leeches.
Wow.
So each bottle had a leech and some rainwater, and they were purposefully arranged in a circle so that the leeches would see each other, and as Merriweather put it, wouldn't get lonely. Like, that was part of the intention of that design. Each bottle's cap, so each bottle had one leech, some water, and in its cap there was a piece of whalebone that was then attached to a string that ran from the bottle to the top of the carousel where it was attached to a bell. So whenever a leech would, like, bump into the whalebone, because it felt a storm was coming on and crawled out of the water, it would hit the whalebone, ring the bell, and then you would hear of the oncoming storm, which my mind immediately went to, like, imagining, like, that dramatic moment in, like, a storm movie where the characters are like, the big one, it's coming, but, like, instead of, like, a tornado in the distance or, like, the crest of a giant wave, it's just, like, a clamor of tiny bells and, like, a bunch of, like, frenzied leeches and bottles.
I'm just imagining, like, a Ride of the Valkyries, but with leeches, like...
Yes.
I'm imagining, like, how Disney would do it, and there's,
I
like,
was
a
just gonna
sleepy
say.
leech, and it, like, looks up, and it's like, and it, like, starts pulling as hard as it can.
Oh, I thought actually by sleepy leech, I thought you were going to say that there were going to be like 7 leeches. There's a sleepy one, a dopey one, one that inexplicably was a doctor, maybe because it had been used in their Victorian medicine.
Could we agree that Doc from Snow White was definitely a PhD? Because he was useless in the medical field.
Not that kind of doctor. Oh, man. Pixar, get on this. We need a short of this entire scenario right now.
Well, the dwarves were pretty short.
Fair enough. But yeah, so I was wondering about like the specific behaviors that he noticed and basically their supposed like correlation to weather patterns in terms of them being predictive. And according to a very mysterious instructional document that I found like attached to the Wikipedia page for this, I tried digging up information on it and like I found like a name and an open source kind of like website for documents that it was uploaded to, but no other information. But it's titled Looking After Your Leech Barometer. So we're just going to take its advice, you know, on the surface for what it is. But apparently, in terms of the interpretations that you would derive, if the leech takes up a position at the bottle's neck, it's going to rain. If he is in continual movement, then thunder and lightning are coming soon. If he's moving rapidly about, expect strong wind when he stops, which, again, as a mental image, I just love. The leech is like in a frenzy and they stop and everyone's like, take cover, the twister's coming. If he is just hanging out in the bottom of his little bottle and is coiled up, then the weather's fine. So that's how you know, like, smooth sailing, it's all good. Or he's just tired from being very agitated and moving around previously. I think that one's a little iffy. And also, if it's in a fixed position, very cold weather is certain to follow, which... Okay. Maybe
or if he's in
a
a fixed position where he's very cold and very hard, then very cold weather has preceded.
Yes. There we go. I will say of all that was just like a few of the predictions on this page. There were none that had to do with anticipating hot weather, but I assume that would have been like a patch for the next upgrade of the prognosticator or something like that. They didn't get to that point, I guess.
They don't have that weather in the UK.
That's true. There was not a need. That's true. So I think 1851 was also the World's Fair Great Exhibition or whatever it was called, where the Crystal Palace was yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was a really interesting building because it was, I think it was almost 1 million square feet. And it was like designed specifically to be the exhibition space. And it was entirely like sheet, like plate glass. And it's a really, like, if you look up these old pictures, because it doesn't exist anymore, but if you look up these pictures of it, it's like, it would have been an extraordinary sight. Like, it's it's kind of like the Javits Center, except like way cooler looking. And it's just like all glass. But it was 3 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral. And just another little architectural like flourish is that it was, for the 1851 Great Exhibition, and it was 1,851 feet long.
Emily, is the leech barometer where we get the old saying, leeches a swarmin', sailors take warning, leeches lay tight, sailors delight? Is it?
Did you just make that up?
Took a minute, yeah.
Not bad.
The one that we had in California was about the snakes, like red on yellow, something mellow.
Oh,
clearly it's very helpful because I can't remember it, so if I saw a snake,
That's
red
like
on black
coral snakes
will
and,
attack.
or copper? Yeah, copperheads.
Right, because one is poisonous and the other mimics the poisonous one, but is safe.
Yeah. Just like a snake
Just
shows
avoid
up.
all of them. Just avoid all the snakes. I think that's generally solid advice. So anyways, Merriweather built his prognosticator, and he filled it with prophetic leeches, and he was so ecstatic with the results that he started writing letters to his colleagues at the Whitby Philosophical Society, essentially to warn them of upcoming storms. He just leapt right in. So,
unfortunately, his idea of carrier leeches did not work as well as he wanted to, and the messages never quite arrived before the storm did.
Still in development. So all the records of his predictions are now stored at the Whitby Museum in the UK. But I saw a few people's responses to his letters, and I have to say they're all just very, unjustifiably enthusiastic. And I say this because the prognosticator had a stipulation that no one seemed to take issue with, which was that it couldn't tell you when a storm was coming or from where, or how bad it would be, just that there would be a weather eventually of some kind. So, for example,
So 100% correct all the time. There will
Exactly.
eventually be weather.
Exactly. It's a bit like the character in Mean Girls. It just,
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
I can
Gretchen
tell
Wieners.
if it's already raining. I think
Exactly.
I have ESPN or something.
that is essentially as effective as the Tempest prognosticator. But so, for example, one response to his letters read, "Your prophetic words are verified, with the exception of about 12 hours." Okay, that's not so bad. But then another from a London news article that was written actually in praise of the prognosticator reads, "The disastrous storm of the month of October 1850 was foretold and communicated by letter 51 hours and a half before it took place."
Wow.
But still, so you're just kind of like, the leeches are moving, and then you just wait for whenever the next storm comes. And I'm like, oh, it's the leeches.
This
Anyways.
sounds like the worst thing for chronically anxious people. Just like,
Exactly.
oh, something's going to happen. Like,
Just sometime. But yeah, so confirmation bias is a hell of a drug. And Merriweather was so fueled by the positive reviews and the Great Exhibition showing that he went as far as proposing that prognosticators be installed at every coastal station in Britain and that a giant one be constructed on top of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. So all of the Londoners could see the frolicking leeches for themselves and be aware of an impending tempest.
but in there were giant sea slugs instead.
To scale, yes. But unfortunately, his leech-filled delusions of grandeur were not in the forecast. So the Tempest prognosticator's fame kind of faded after the Great Exhibition, and it's now considered to be, as you'd expect, nonsense. I will say I did look a little into whether there was any actual science to back it up, and found that leeches are known to leave water when it has low oxygen levels, so they'll basically go above to the air to just be able to breathe better. And drops in barometric pressure can actually reduce the concentration of dissolved oxygen in water. So if the leeches maybe sensed that as the pressure dropped and a storm was approaching, then maybe they would leave the water. But honestly, probably not, from what I can tell. But this story, in particular, all of its kind of misplaced enthusiasm for pseudoscience, does tell us about the state of meteorology at the time. So to give a very brief history of weather prediction, we couldn't really do it in any data-driven or modeling-based way until the 20th century. And even when the first barometers and thermometers and and weather measuring tools started to appear towards the end of the Renaissance, while we did begin to gain some scientific understanding about the weather, it was still not enough to inform any predictions apart from anecdotal observations that were still, mostly just coincidental. Even with the barometers, which early on people were noticing that, they would change in appearance as the storm was approaching, they weren't really used to sort of predict and capture atmospheric changes preceding storms in any kind of regulated or applied way until the 19th century. So for a long time, it was just all mystical, and honestly, it still kind of is. But this brings us to the 19th century, when we still couldn't predict weather, see the Tempest prognosticator, but we began to understand more about its fundamentals in terms of, for example, how storms actually work. And we're also getting better at actually tracking and recording weather patterns in a concerted and more scientific way. And very importantly, thanks to the invention of the telegraph, it also became possible to quickly communicate local weather conditions and warn neighboring communities about oncoming storms. So Robert Fitzroy, who was on the pod actually a few episodes ago for requesting Charles Darwin's companionship when he captained, Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, he actually spearheaded this effort of reporting and disseminating news of local weather in Britain. And by 10 years after the Great Exhibition and the Tempest prognosticator's debut, the British Royal Navy had gathered a ton of weather data, was writing up all sorts of charts, and coastal stations were telegraphing weather conditions to each other and even to the Times newspaper in London for daily recording. At the same time in the U.S., the National Weather Service actually came into existence by doing pretty much the same thing. And actually, the term forecasting was coined by Robert Fitzroy as part of this work, essentially. So, although George Mayweather's invention didn't weather the test of time, I would like to leave you with a few quotes from his writings that tell an adjacent but I think happier tale. So I mentioned earlier that he arranged the leeches in a circular formation to, well, in his words, prevent them from enduring the affliction of solitary confinement. So he cared about them. He didn't want them to be lonely. He also referred to his leeches quite lovingly as his council of philosophers and wrote, "Some of them have, over and over again, thrown themselves into graceful undulations when I have approached them, I suppose as an expression of their being glad to see me." Which, I think, just goes to show it's not about the tempests you prognosticate, but the friends you make along the way.
That's so cool. This just reminded me of the plan for basically nuclear reporting in animals. So humans made a lot of nuclear stuff. It's a thing we do. And then we bury it or whatever. And they're like, how are we going to communicate this to future generations? And I feel like I must have talked about this with one of you. It seems like the stuff we talk about.
Well, you don't know any other people.
That's true.
Had to be.
But they had a plan that was like never enacted. But could they introduce a gene into wild mammals that basically, like a Geiger counter, in the presence of radioactivity would activate a green fluorescent protein, so that if wild animals wandered over radiation like 10,000 years from now, they would have inherited this radiation-activated glowing gene, and humans or whatever species is in, like, you know, the most smart would see it and associate it with radiation and like run away. And so like we could create this response.
You know, like how we exterminated all the fireflies.
Wait.
And we don't love them and put them in jars and hang out with them all the time. What if like there was an ancient society that buried loads of nuclear material and they did that to fireflies, and we just frolic through the fields of fireflies just being irradiated?
That's true. We would have to know that it means something bad, and we're not that smart.
Wait, but so the idea behind it, though, is to get humans to associate glowing greenness with radiation?
Basically, yeah, in the absence of language, just have this like natural reporting that any species that sees like, oh, that thing's glowing green, this is a bad place to be.
So I think, as Rob said, like the issue is that if you bury something that's going to take tens of thousands of years, best case, to like break down and stop being dangerous.
Okay.
Whatever, like the signs that you put there still have to be like meaningful to people who may not even share the same language or like have the same symbology that you do.
Yeah.
So like that's like, it's a big design question.
Which makes you...
Luckily, Kristina's here.
That's not one we've solved.
It makes you...
Just put them all in museums.
This makes you wonder if like a dinosaur biochemist like made leeches so that whenever like the pressure changes, they'd like start moving. They're like, this will mean something to people in the future.
When you feel the pressure change from a meteor, it's too late.
It's true. No amount of GFP will help you there.
I will say California has fireflies, but the species of fireflies that are in California don't actually glow. So they're technically still a firefly, but they don't actually tell anyone about their radiation that they're trying to communicate.
California is safe.
Everyone moved to the West Coast. West Coast, best coast.
This week I learned that the house of the future is in the past.
Ooh.
Oh, do tell.
Yes. So
is it just someone who lives in a DeLorean?
No, we are going to do a whole nother Back to the Future theme show. I hope.
I'm here for that.
But this is about kind of the persistence of the idea that World's Fairs demonstrate what's going to happen in the future. And so World's Fairs are largely showing a world that we could live in rather than the world that we do. And to look into this a little bit more, it's just an opportunity for me to tell you about one of my favorite architects, engineers, and thinkers, and how his futuristic dreaming led to the acceptance, but maybe the kind of otherification of a whole branch of architecture. So this kind of, I would say, has always been in World's Fairs, forward-thinking technological displays. But looking back, I'm going to pick on a few kind of cherry-picked historical events. One of which is in 1930, the creation of something called the Dymaxion House. And are you familiar with Dymaxion? Kristina is reacting. the Dymaxion house and the idea of Dymaxion is something that I am absolutely in love with and have been for years. So it is the brainchild of Buckminster Fuller, who the laboratory scientists might know for his kind of conceptualization of Buckminster Fullerene, the carbon structure that is a geodesic dome. And so Buckminster Fuller was an incredible 20th century thinker. Dymaxion is a sort of portmanteau for dynamic maximum tension. And it is basically just turning the idea of a car and a house on its head to achieve kind of much more realistic or much more kind of practical achievements. So the Dymaxion car is a 3-wheeled car that looks like a submarine that has a turning radius that is approximately like 6 inches longer than the car itself. It is just an incredible engineering idea that was fuel efficient, that was cheaper to produce, but it just looked ridiculous. And so it was never a commercial viable success. The Dymaxion house was something that he introduced in 1930. And he actually like kind of pushed this idea of a super efficient house. So the Dymaxion house it's a round house where basically everything is...
She's a round house.
Yes, this has nothing to do with what's his name? Chuck Norris. There's no Chuck Norris involved. But roundhouse kick. Anyway.
Oh.
But it is a circular house. I think it's corrugated metal sides and just like incredibly efficient design for heat. And one of the major ideas that Buckminster Fuller believed in was maximum volume for minimum surface area. And so
what he wanted was a house that was fuller.
Yes, he...
Isn't there a show about that on Netflix now?
Yes. It's all about geodesic domes.
I would sooner watch it if it was.
But so he designed these houses, and he actually drew up what a suburb would look like. Kind of like, if you remember, actually, if we were a minute ago, speaking of Back to the Future, when you see in the 50s these maps of the new suburbs and what they're going to look like, and like, you know, all made of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same. He made a suburb of little round houses that were all fuel efficient, energy efficient, like well insulated, but they kind of all looked like small UFOs. And so they were, again, like distinctly unpopular among consumers. But they were cheap to build, and he really thought this would be a solution for the Great Depression, for kind of lowering costs of production. And I think he never understood why people didn't understand him, which is kind of one of the amazing things. He was such a dynamic thinker. But he pushed the house in 1930. He remodeled it in 1945 when kind of the Depression and the war had ended, and it still never caught on. And so the 1933 World's Fair is where I want to tie into our theme first. So in that World's Fair is the Chicago Grand Expo. And there was a famous exhibit called the 1933 Homes of Tomorrow exhibition. And it featured numerous architects of the day and all these different styles of homes that they made. And this actually just came up last year because they were built in Chicago, kept for the World's Fair. The 1933 World's Fair is an exceptional World's Fair for a number of reasons. It's the only World's Fair that ever basically paid for itself. They extended it past the end date because it was a financial success, and it went for almost 2 years. And it paid back the bonds during the Great Depression, which is a remarkable thing to think about. That it was a financial success. It had tons of expos and all the things you find at a World's Fair, and when they were done, they were actually able to kind of parse out pieces of it and sell them off. So this Houses of Tomorrow exhibit that featured a good housekeeping house, numerous architects, and some famous examples, one called the Florida Tropical House and another called the Cypress Log Cabin, which were these kind of beautiful architectural designs that were forward-thinking, but like traditional, but with a twist. They were kind of lauded as the future of American housing, and not Buckminster Fuller. Like, they looked nothing like Buckminster Fuller. They had well, for one thing, they had corners. They looked like homes. But so, and I bring it up also because in 2019, they were put on the market. So they were barged across to Indiana, and you can now buy and refurbish one of the 1933 homes of the future, which are decidedly a little bit, past prime. But so the selling price is not too bad, but the owners estimated it would be $2.5 million to renovate them and make them livable again. But if you want to live in Indiana, that'd be a cool way to do it.
These are kind of prefiguring the mail order catalog houses that come after World War II, where you can literally order a prefab house from a Sears catalog, and all of the pieces arrive and you're able to plop everything together on your own. And people are so enthused by these now that they'll go around the country trying to find and spot these Sears catalog homes, identify them, see what modifications have been made. They're kind of their original tiny home.
Cool.
That's super
Yeah.
cool. But so those were the homes that were popular. Like these captured the imagination and like were a commercial success in a way, or they led to the next stage of American home building. But they, for that, don't look particularly futuristic. And Buckminster Fuller kind of kept going on his own, being this maverick engineer architect, trying to make people see that his ideas were better. So there's a 30-odd year gap between him introducing the Dymaxion house and what we might know as one of the best examples in a World's Fair of his design, which is the 1967 Expo in Montreal, the Montreal Biosphere. And so I'll mention that in a second. In the meantime, though, in that 37-year span, he wrote some of the most interesting kind of philosophy that I've ever read. And so he hated the idea of Earth, like any conception of Earth.
Full stop.
Stupid
I'm
planet.
designing things so we can live on the moon.
Well, and I'll also tell you in a second about the huge influence he had on sci-fi. But so he hated the idea of Earth as a flat object, which I think we can all relate to now.
Look, it's the way Earth is, okay? You can't hate.
But like, so people would say like, oh, this thing went up and this thing went down. And he thought that was like not just like inaccurate, but dangerous. He wanted to say this object went out or this object went in, because we should think about the three-dimensional sphere of Earth. And if you drop something, you drop it in. And if you throw it out. And it just, like, there's nothing wrong with that. We just don't do that because we think in like this very flat, small piece of the world that we live in. But it would be so easy to just use those words and then kind of internalize this idea of radiating outward and kind of collapsing inward.
I think that's one of my favorite things about the ways that people like Buckminster Fuller write, is that they're so careful with the rhetoric and their vocabulary, and they're so deliberate that it really is a way of world building and changing perspective in the specificity of the terms that they use. It's really challenging you to rethink things, not only in the visual appearance, but also in kind of the way you experience them through text.
And so he bought into all of this. He really thought that the language we use affects the way we think, and it also limits the way we think. And so you could then kind of unlimit the way you think by changing your language. And that also applies to designs and structures and shapes. So the shape that he is most famous for is the geodesic dome, which is the shape of Buckminster Fullerene. And it is, I believe, in kind of it's a 60-sided shape. And it is as close to a sphere as you might hope to build out of triangles. And so it maximizes volume for surface area, which makes it a very attractive engineering goal. And it also looks futuristic. It looks kind of impossibly new and different. And again, lacks harsh corners. And so it is a throwing...
I can't help but feel like you're describing me. I really like the idea that people are attracted to the design principle of maximizing surface to volume, having no hard corners, being essentially shaped like a sphere. Thank you. You're making me feel so much better.
Don't thank me. It's all Bucky.
Let's say, to me, he sounds like A well-rounded individual in a world of squares.
Yes, but so the geodesic dome, that perfect shape, that's maybe the most famous, especially associated with World's Fairs, is the 1967 Montreal Expo biome or biosphere. And it is a tremendous, I believe, not the largest, but one of the largest geodesic domes that exists and still stands today. And that was like that was kind of a realization of what this shape could be, how powerful it can look, and it's like this marvelous clear glass structure that has all these levels inside of it. And it was in 1967 actually a really interesting time because Buckminster Fuller had established himself. He was famous and recognized and was getting pretty big contracts. And it shows like this real progression of how his thought was being like reanalyzed. And so it's in that kind of period from the 60s onward that his work is really much more appreciated. And you do see geodesic domes kind of popping up all over, not all over the place. There are dozens of them like in architecture. So even as early as the 1939 World's Fair, elements of the geodesic dome were making it into World's Fairs. So the Queen's Aviary, part of the Queen's Zoo, has a geodesic dome. It's just not a full sphere. It's a dome, a glass dome on top of the building. And that was an early kind of rendering of it in real life, but also at a World's Fair, still very futuristic. By the 60s, it was huge. It was the centerpiece. And what we might know as the most famous geodesic dome is Epcot, which was finished in 1982. And I want to just tie in all the people who make this thing so interesting. So Epcot was an inspiration of Ray Bradbury, the author, who was, of course, inspired physically by Buckminster Fuller. But there were a lot of other people who bought into this idea that the geodesic dome was this perfect futuristic shape. And the other one is Robert Heinlein. Robert Heinlein was one of the big three of English science fiction writers, up there with Isaac Asimov and who would be Arthur C. Clarke. They were like the big three. And he wrote Starship Troopers and Stranger in a Strange Land, these kind of early masterpieces of what's called hard science fiction, where he really rigorously studied the science so that it wasn't a ridiculous story. And so there's this really beautiful marriage of creativity, but also rigorous principle that gets you a geodesic dome or a story like Stranger in a Strange Land that really pulls you into this mythos, this kind of, this is possible. And it's just that you've never seen it before, but it's not unreal. So all of these huge minds in science fiction were now buying into the Buckminster Fuller idea, and that's by 1982. For the New Yorkers, when the Mets were being founded as a team, they actually gave Buckminster Fuller a contract to build what would be Shea Stadium. And he was like, geodesic dome. And they were like, no.
What were they expecting?
Yeah, I know.
Well, then we got the Astrodome.
Kind of his thing.
Yeah. But they turned him down. Even in like by the late 60s or the mid 60s, the Mets were not ready, or like New York society was not ready for the geodesic dome to be a real thing. It was still whimsical and imaginative. So Epcot is sort of where the geodesic dome peaks, I think. Like that's where it hit its high. But so I think it's so interesting that all of these houses of the future that were projected, they were put into the World's Fair not so much because they were more dynamic or more interesting, but just because they were, there was some stake holders. Someone who, sorry, that was someone holding stake the way I said it. There were some angry butchers who walked outside.
You want these?
There were some stakeholders like architecture firms that were paying for it, that were actually going to do it. And it wasn't so much a place to see a new idea as a place to just kind of get a glimpse of what was already in the pipeline. And this is just a quick opportunity for me to bring up one other thing related to Disney World and the House of the Future. So you've all heard of Monsanto, right?
Yes.
Doesn't have the best PR these days. In the year 1957, they imagined what the house of 1980 would look like. And it kind of, honestly, I could see this house being somewhere in like Beverly Hills. It like is a fashionable looking futuristic house, but Monsanto built the plastic house, in which every element of construction, including the windows, the chairs, like the beams and the struts, were plastic. Yes, that is what the world gave it. Emily gives it a resounding
That was a thumbs down.
Yeah.
Monsanto at their usual tricks.
All right, Kristina, blow us away.
Great. So what I was thinking about this week, of course, has some element of a competition, because what do I do that doesn't involve a competition? This one between Paris and New York. But I really want to focus on the 1964 World's Fair in New York, and that might produce images of the notorious developer Robert Moses. GM had an exhibition called Futurama, which presented speculative visions of society, as Rob has been talking about. We can also blame the 1964 World's Fair for giving us It's a Small World. Walt Disney presented that at the UNICEF Pavilion, so there you go. But fewer people know that the 1964 World's Fair in Queens was also the site of the first televised fashion show. Fashion and World's Fairs have a long-standing relationship, but this particular incident gets at the heart of World's Fairs as a concept, namely using material culture to develop and promote a national identity on an international stage. So to look at the development of this relationship between fashion and World's Fair, and this relationship's impact on American culture and dress practice, the way we clothe ourselves at large, we have to go back to the 19th century. So this story starts at the 1893 World's Fair. It's the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. That fair was organized to correspond to the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus arriving in America. Boo, controversial.
It was 1893.
Yeah, they were a year off. But this site in Chicago, in addition to being a kind of controversial site for urban planning in Chicago, they cleared a lot of low-income housing to make way for the fair site. It was actually planned by Frederick Law Olmsted, which New Yorkers might know as being the same landscape architect who designed Central Park. So World's Fairs, particularly that one, are often overshadowed by kind of new innovations in industry. This one perhaps best known today for the series of infamous murders by H.H. Holmes, captured in Devil in the White City. But while all of this kind of gruesome activity is happening, quietly, several Parisian dressmakers were exhibiting their very luxurious Victorian-style dresses, which caught the attention of buyers from the biggest department store in Chicago at the time, which was Marshall Field's. It also caught the attention of another huge retailer in Philadelphia, Wanamaker's. Both stores began importing Paris fashions after this show. They were so captivated by the designs that they saw, and just about every other department store in the U.S. started following suit after that, of course, including those in New York City.
So are these, like, just to picture it, are these kind of like the frilly bottomed, like what kinds of accessories or accents?
Every layer that you can think of, really high necks, so almost like turtleneck, frilly, lots of buttons. You have a corset underneath, and then you have long sleeves. You maybe have a big, kind of exaggerated, bustled bottom, long draping fabrics. If you think about maybe the 1920s, when flappers kind of reigned supreme with this very loose columnar silhouette, it's the designs that flappers were kind of reacting to. So very constrictive, very manipulative, trying to change the shape of women's bodies in various ways.
Okay, so like a Keira Knightley Pirates of the Caribbean Gatsby.
You got it. Okay. Yeah. So by 1914, the U.S. is completely enamored by these designs. U.S. department stores were 100% dependent on French fashions to dictate styles and trends. And there are even stories of American buyers working for these department stores who went through great pains at great personal risk to continue obtaining garments from Paris, even as World War I was escalating in Europe. Fashion really being a life or death question in this incident. By way of context, in this period in the early 20th century, Paris fashion has this really legendary status that is so deeply entrenched in the public imagination that you weren't a fashionable person fit for viewing in public if your clothing didn't somehow connect you to Parisian design. Fashionable dress had to either be an original design from Paris, so haute couture, or it had to be an American-made copy of haute couture, which was manufactured in the US based on those garments that buyers were painstakingly dragging back from France.
Now, was the idea there that people who saw you in the American facsimile like couldn't tell the difference, or was it like it has to at least look like this genre of clothing?
So that's the interesting thing, is there's kind of shifting ideas around what is actually the best. The Paris original haute couture has a certain price point that was only accessible to the very, very elite. If you were not able to purchase garments at that level, an American-made copy was perfectly acceptable. And there's points at which later in history, department stores are really capitalizing on this idea of the American-made version almost being better in some ways. So this is the tension that you see playing out and building and building and building up to the 64 World's Fair, this question of national identity, buying power, who's setting the trends. And at this point, no one's really considering any designers in New York to be of note. You don't think of ingenuity or anything particularly innovative coming out of New York. New York didn't have this status as a fashion capital. Certainly nowhere else in the US did either. So despite a few attempts in the late 1800s, early 1900s to elevate this reputation around American fashion, this most lauded vision of Paris fashion really only started to be challenged during the Great Depression, when it became too costly for department stores to continue importing French styles. So they're like, oops, we can't. How do we market this? Oh, wait. By 1935, actually, only about 1% of clothing sold in the US was a Paris original or even an American-made copy. Instead, department stores were really shifting their attention to purchasing, promoting, and selling the work of American designers. Fashion designers tend to credit this shift to Dorothy Shaver. She was the manager of the New York department store Lord & Taylor, and she really spearheaded this effort towards focusing on American design. She insisted on promoting the designs of Americans, many of whom were women, working in the early 20th century. Furthermore, the economic climate of the Depression facilitated this wider embrace of more informal clothing, see yoga wear, which was actually adopted from sportswear and became a specialty for American designers. So if we think back to the 1890s, when those French dressmakers were showing their garments at the World's Fair in Chicago, sports clothing was really only meant to be worn while performing specific activities. And these, of course, are activities reserved for the upper classes. So archery, tennis, horseback riding, skiing. You'd have a specific outfit.
Sports of the people.
The sports of the people. So in the late 1920s, 1930s, those kind of casual sportswear precursor to athleisure were adopted by a broader segment of the population for wear in everyday life, partly because these clothes were made for cheaper fabrics to keep prices low. And interestingly, trends that were dictating the fashion market at this time were increasingly coming from, believe it or not, California, rather than from Paris, due in large part to the increasing prominence of the motion picture industry. So Hollywood films of this period had a huge influence on American dress practice, both as design originators, so the costume designers who are creating pieces for the fashion are really dictating trends, and also these film studios had a huge role in disseminating fashion trends. There was a coordinated and intensive marketing campaign that paired the release of new Hollywood films with the sale of fashions worn by stars in each film. So screen styles such as those worn by Joan Crawford in the film Letty Linton, she has this really dramatically ruffled dress that's all white, was hugely popular, and Macy's claimed to have sold 500,000 Letty Linton dresses in the year the film was released in 1932.
Wow.
Interestingly, if you go back and are watching films of this period, there's often this moment where there's this seemingly random fashion show in the middle of the feature that has nothing to do with advancing the narrative or developing a character. It's just kind of like, pause, fashion show. And this was very much deliberate in order to showcase the fashions that would then be marketed and sold as part of the film's release. So this shift in prominence away from Parisian design and towards American-made designs continued to grow. And if we look kind of circling this back to World's Fairs, at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, designs by leading American manufacturers were exhibited at a specific hall of fashions. And while 5 fashion shows were being presented each day at this pavilion, the U.S. was still nearly 30 years away from these kinds of presentations being accessible to the American population at large. It was only if you were able to visit this fair in person that you would have seen this kind of event. The thing that kind of clinched this shift is in the 1940s, the emphasis on American design was really bolstered by the closing of haute couture houses during the Nazi occupation of Paris during World War II. There was no way to get French designs, even if they wanted them in the US. After the war, Paris did try to make a bit of a comeback and reassert its position in the hierarchy of fashion in the US when Christian Dior debuted a new silhouette for women's fashion in 1947, known as the New Look. So the New Look was very much a deliberate reaction to the austerity and rationing that dictated clothing during the war. If you imagine, if you're Marvel fans and you watch Agent Carter, for example, you can think of very uniformed, kind of broad-shouldered but straight-bodied garments. The New Look had this flowing, voluminous skirt. It required several yards of fabric to produce, thus was very expensive. It had these rounded shoulders and a really tightly cinched waist. With this kind of new trend for a new vision of femininity and feminine dress practices, Paris really reestablished itself as the leader of fashion trends, positioning itself at the forefront of style. And of course, American department stores were once again clamoring to get these designs. As a kind of interesting story about how this is all working, this is something that I love doing, is not only looking at the objects and the stories, but also how they were then disseminated to the public. So in the mid-century after World War II, there's this really kind of complex and back-channel network that ensured that designs presented in Paris then appeared in the American press and thus on the production lines of American manufacturers at this really breakneck speed to facilitate all of the sales and demand. Reporters from mainstream media outlets were often banned from seeing new collections in Paris until several weeks after their debut to kind of counteract this. Yet there are stories that abound of undercover reporters, often working for trade publications like the infamous Women's Wear Daily, which was published every day. These reporters were interrogating models, buyers, and even socialites who had been invited to the fashion shows in order to glean an understanding of what had been shown. And inevitably, a description and then sometimes a sketch or an illustration appeared the following day in print in the U.S.
It really sounds like you're describing like a police investigation because not only are you interrogating people to try to figure out what someone was, say, wearing, to try to figure out what was going on at a particular event, you're also producing sketches to try to help other people understand, just in case they see it on the street.
Yeah, that telegraph not only sends the weather of the leeches, but it also sends the fashions of the day.
And I'm picturing like a lineup too of just women in various dresses. Like, all right, who did you see going down the runway?
Yes, they're all smoking. Yes. So just a few weeks often after these designs were shown in Paris, copies would appear for sale in stores across the U.S. There was this really vast network of producers who were bustling behind the scenes to bring these designs to life, and all of it, for the most part, happened here in New York in the city's garment district. So if you happen to have watched the TV show The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, you probably have a pretty good idea of dress racks and factories and lofts, all of which are the hub of this production.
Huh. So that's like fast fashion even back then.
This is the emergence of ready-to-wear. When sizing had become standardized, you don't have a tailor making something bespoke for you that fits just your body and is custom. Instead, you're just pulling something off the rack that's ready to go. If we think about these department stores as being like a real hub for how these fashions are being disseminated to the American public, places like Macy's were so eager to publicize the date by which their copies of French couture would be available to purchase. There's great New York Times articles talking about the thousands of women that are flocking to New York for these presentations. And it's everyone from the person on the street who is someone like us, who has kind of a smaller, reduced buying power, to someone like Lauren Bacall or a big Hollywood fashion star. They're all trying to get these same garments. And like I was saying, what's really interesting is that these advertisements really promote the renown of American-made copies as a particular key selling point that is actually making it more covetous for the customer. So one of the most controversial garments moving through this complex system of originals and copies and sparking huge debate in New York just before the 1964 World's Fair opens is a design by the French couturier André Courrèges. So in February, here we have our, rivalry, France and New York. In February 1964, Courrèges had boldly proposed this new style for women that incorporated pants.
What?
About time.
Right. So pants, not a new concept, and certainly not new to imagine women wearing in the 1960s. American women had adopted pants for wear outside the home and outside of those specific sporting activities during World War II, if you think about A League of Our Own, when involvement in the war effort often necessitated this practical garment. But the practice of women wearing pants as part of everyday wear had largely disappeared in the more conservative environment of the immediate post-war period. So now we've kind of gone through this cycle. Fashion can be very cyclical in this way, and we're now in the early 60s when pants are kind of returning to the public consciousness. Courrèges in particular was designing not for this mature woman whose tastes and wallets had kind of dominated the post-war market, but instead for this growing contingent of young women who were emboldened by their increasing buying power and entering the workforce in growing numbers as young professionals. His designs were edgy, they were avant-garde, and they were largely inspired by the fantasy of the space race. He had these really great plastic eclipse glasses that had just this tiny slit in them. They were called eclipse glasses. And then these really kind of over-the-top large waist bucket hats that really looked like someone had flipped a trash can on top of these models' heads, all in white. So his pants in particular sparked huge debate around their suitability for women in the workplace, with camps dividing along both gendered and generational lines. This frenzy around French fashion and its impact on American culture was really reaching a boiling point as the 1964 World's Fair approached.
I just have to point out the incidental pun that you're wondering about pants suitability.
Oh, very nice. I wonder too, was this kind of also partly informed by the idea that sort of started becoming more of a thing in like the mid 50s? Like I've read a bit about like Audrey Hepburn and Sabrina and her collaboration with Givenchy, sort of like kind of starting to instill the idea that women didn't necessarily have to dress for like the male gaze, but kind of like her sort of higher necklines and kind of like different kind of shapes and structures to her gowns, sort of dressing for her own like what was at the time not classically like beautiful body shape. I wonder too if that kind of like if that sort of like era of like fashion kind of adapting like for women to feel confident in that is like suited to their bodies also kind of like led into like women can now dress functionally for themselves for the office, because it's not just about like they're not going through the world in fancy clothing like to be basically taken in by the men around them, but they're carrying out their own purposes as well.
Totally. And Audrey Hepburn wears Courrèges pantsuits and designs in How to Steal a Million. She has a waist bucket hat when she's in her tiny little coupe car in the early scenes when she's driving around Paris. I will
Seen
say,
that, but I want to fix that now.
I will say that his clothes were really designed for the Audrey Hepburn type woman, this very waif-like, thin, slim, and long woman. There's a great quote that Diana Vreeland, who's the editor-in-chief of Vogue at the time, says in reaction to this debate around pants, that she says, women who look good in pants will always wear pants. They always have, they always will. The big thing to think about now is legs. This period is all about legs, which kind of hints at the coming youthquake and what we think about in the later 60s as the miniskirt and this sexual and the sexual revolution that really gave women more empowerment in the way that they dressed. This is a bit earlier than that, but it's all what's kind of laying the seeds and the foundations for what's to come.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's the French team. Now on the American side, concurrent to this kind of reinvigorated appreciation of French design was this renewed effort by the American fashion industry to elevate the status of the American designer and promote their garments after World War II. So designers of this period are those like Bonnie Passion, Rudy Gernrich, who's the creator of the monokini, this very controversial topless swimsuit, and other designers like Geoffrey Beene, who were part of this vanguard, establishing a reputation for the creativity and high quality of American design that transcended these mass market replications of Parisian haute couture. The American fashion industry dedicated a ton of energy towards advocating for its importance and authority, which really came to a head at the World's Fair in Queens. So on May 25th, 1964, the Council of Fashion Designers of America, we know them as the CFDA today, it was an organization founded just 2 years earlier, in 1962, by Eleanor Lambert to promote American design. The CFDA presented the first in a series of fashion shows at the U.S. Pavilion of the World's Fair, making the claim that fashion be considered as seriously as other forms of art and industry on display. This first show presented the CFDA's vision of the state of American fashion and included looks by our fashion designers like Geoffrey Beene, who I just mentioned. Beene in particular showed action skirt, it was called. It was part of a suit in his new fall collection, which used extra yards of fabric to create, quote, a flurry of pleats for easy striding.
That's a really great phrase.
Okay.
A flurry of pleats for easy striding. I really love that.
Yeah, it was meant to enable the woman who wore his designs to move more deftly and with unencumbered steps. So if you think back to Victorian dressing, where often skirts are bustled, they're very narrow, you can't really walk and move around, this is kind of moving in a full other direction. So this fashion show at the World's Fair was broadcast across America in a program that was hosted by Nancy White, who was then the editor of Harper's Bazaar, and it was the first fashion show to be televised in the U.S. People had seen fashion shows in film, maybe had heard about them, or if they'd been to a World's Fair previously, maybe had been able to experience them in person, but never at this kind of scale of replication. So not only was this perspective on American fashion that the CFDA was presenting at the World's Fair making an important claim about the status of women in America, but it was also making an important claim about American women as the country was presenting itself to other nations abroad. American fashion had not only firmly inserted itself into the sphere of serious art and industry by participating at the World's Fair, but it also took on this role as a cultural ambassador in the midst of rising Cold War tensions, which kind of perfectly suited itself to the US's political agenda by emphasizing the increasingly prominent role of women within its borders. This first televised fashion show then represents a significant moment in the development of American fashion that began in the 19th century and kind of reached a zenith in the 1964 World's Fair.
I love the idea of like fashion as diplomacy. Were there any like Soviet delegations, fashion delegations to the 1964 World's Fair?
I don't know.
Or vice versa?
Yeah. In the kind of cultural diplomacy program of the U.S. of this time, they were really looking to avant-garde art. So Martha Graham, who is the great choreographer and dancer who really shifted modern dance away from classical ballet into something more experimental and avant-garde, she stages a ballet around this time of a reimagining of Phaedra. And it takes on this kind of very feminist approach. And this was seen as very kind of titillating and controversial to American audiences, but it was adopted by this program of cultural diplomacy and shown all around the world. And it just wouldn't do to have an American program censored when that's the very crux of what Americans are trying to say they stand against. So even though it went so far as to be discussed in congressional hearings and discussed as far as how the American public could possibly stand to see such salacious things on a stage, it ended up being kind of the perfect piece to represent the U.S. abroad.
All right, so it's time for our quiz. So, of course, because our theme is World's Fairs, this quiz will be all about the different inventions you may have heard of, but you didn't know they were debuted at World's Fairs.
Fax machine. Go.
Fax machine. I had to cut out that question. I actually just switched it to a different invention that was also at that same World's Fair. So it was fertile ground for quizzes. All right, so question 1. What invention debuted at a World's Fair caused Brazil's Emperor Dom Pedro to famously say, "My God, it talks"? What was the invention?
Furby.
You are absolutely right. No, it's not a Furby.
No. I got so excited.
Wow.
I mean, those things were huge. I wouldn't have been that surprised.
They were popular. They weren't huge. They were
Yeah, well, yes, but they took the world by storm.
And you know how we projected? We projected that those were going to take the world by storm with our leeches.
Oh my God.
Okay, so what invention debuted at a World's Fair caused Brazil's Emperor Dom Pedro to famously say, "My God, it talks"?
Oh, emperor.
Yeah, when do we think Brazil last had an
I might
emperor?
not have the right name, but like conceptually, I'm imagining something where it's like you enter text into a machine and it converts it to like a vocoder sort of situation. Maybe. Like a machine that you tell it to say a thing and it says a thing and he's like, but it's a machine.
I was imagining like a kitchen appliance for some reason.
Like, your food is done.
My God, it talks. I haven't cooked whatever I was making well enough.
I have a rice cooker that plays the tune to Twinkle Twinkle Little Star when it's done cooking rice. So,
That's very sweet.
Okay, so what's the answer?
Things that make voice noises would be like radios. That's kind of where I'm landing on this one, but I don't know.
Okay. Marconi was like the 20s, right? For radio, I think.
That's the sound of certainty.
No idea.
As Rob nodded.
I was just like,
with all the certainty of a leech.
All right, final answer.
if we say device, does that get us a loophole answer?
Do you want the answer to be a device? I'll say it's a device.
okay.
We got it!
The answer was the telephone.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Even earlier than I thought.
Yeah, it was 1876 at the Philadelphia World's Fair.
Wow.
Alexander Graham Bell first introduced his invention of the telephone, which really freaked out the Emperor of Brazil.
Apparently.
It talks. Yes, that's the point.
Okay, question 2. So we've discussed on this podcast before how the Eiffel Tower was first built for the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. My question to you is, how long was it supposed to be up for? It wasn't intended to stay up forever. They intended to tear it down. But how long did they want to give it?
Ooh, a lot of these expos are slated for like 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to go 8, which is right in the middle of that.
Yeah.
And I think as our previous, our tradition is with the Fax Machine honor code is that I will also let you decide what you think a fair margin of error is.
Okay.
Then I
I
might.
think if we get the scale of time correct. So if we answer in months and
I would say go for years. I'll say how many years was this supposed to stand for.
Okay.
Okay, that already changes our answer then.
Yeah.
Or at least for me.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty expensive to build an Eiffel Tower. So maybe 50 years? I don't know. Like, or if you build a grand thing, would you like take it down in 100 years? I don't know. No,
I was going to say like 2.
Yeah. Like 2 is how long the whole thing would be.
Well, because it's weird, because I feel like if it were something that was meant to be up for a fairly short amount of time, like under 5 years, they wouldn't have built it as sturdily as they did. Maybe that's wrong, but
people still have to
clearly,
go up
it's
it.
built to last.
Like the first Ferris wheel was built
Yeah.
and taken apart in about 2 years. I think that was in Chicago.
The Chicago wheel.
Yes.
It was
not the
originally
Ferris wheel.
called.
Yeah. That's right,
Yeah.
that's right.
So maybe it is
okay.
2 years.
Yeah.
And
The
our
idea to
window
maybe move it
is
elsewhere or not.
maybe we should say 10 years, and our window is plus minus 10 years. That's
Anywhere between 0 and 20 years?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The answer was 20 years.
Oh!
Barely got it.
All you need is enough.
It was intended to be taken down 20 years later, so in
Wow.
1909, I think. It was 1889 to 1909,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
All right, so we briefly just discussed in your deliberation about the Eiffel Tower, you mentioned the first Ferris wheel. So basically, in 1893, George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. was tasked with creating a landmark that would be like equal in sort of like scale to the Eiffel Tower, and just to like wow people on that sort of level, like some big mechanical structure that could do something really cool. So the question is, how many people could fit on the first Ferris wheel?
I have to give a
Again.
disclaimer
A disclaimer?
that I was reading about this earlier today.
Okay,
That
Nice.
counts.
It's over 2,000 people. It's like 2,100 something people total.
Wow.
Because there were like 36 gondolas, and they were each supposed to hold like 50 or 60 people.
Wow.
Am I totally off?
Well, there were 36, as you said, gondolas or cars, so I'm pretty impressed. I want to ask, though, what's your final answer?
So do we want to say, okay, so 36 times 50 is 1,800, so maybe 2,000 plus minus 500?
Okay, well, you could have gone way less than that, because I think Kristina said 2,100. It was 2,160.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah, so it was 260 feet tall. It had 36 cars and could hold 2,160 people at once. It was very popular and cost each person 50 cents each in 1893. So,
And how much of that money did Ferris get? None of it. Absolutely none of it.
Yeah.
He died like shortly thereafter, completely destitute. I'm afraid to say, yeah.
Yeah.
well, what goes around comes around.
Ferris wheel.
Does
I
that
don't know
must
what
come
I'm
down?
implying he did to deserve to die. in jail. But,
I think he was an okay dude, but I can't really say either.
oh, okay. Anyway, sorry, George.
Poor guy just wanted a day off.
All right, question 4. Josephine Garris Cochran debuted her biggest invention in 1886 after years of trying to find a way to do what faster than her servants?
Oh, did she invent the dishwasher?
Ooh.
Oh,
Cochran?
It might be. So he mentioned that, and my mind went to laundry. So now I'm wondering if it's like laundry machine.
Because of like a big machine that would have soap and water in it.
Yeah. What was the year for this again?
1886. It was debuted.
Okay, so both dishes and clothing existed.
Checks out.
Also servants.
But I'm sorry, the World's Fair. It was debuted. That was 1893. I think it was like introduced in 1886, but when it became popular, more people knew about it in 1893. After.
Oh, okay. In Chicago, Sears Tower, Sears sells probably both dishwashers and washing machines. But I'm just drawing lines between the dots now.
The red string's coming out.
Yeah.
All right, what do y'all think it was? What she want to do faster than her servants?
This is
laundry,
also
that
like
helps.
peak textile moment for interiors and dressing, where everyone had a tablecloth and 10 different things over their windows and 50 different things on their bodies. If we feel like finding some rationalization out of nowhere.
I'm team laundry now.
I'll go team laundry.
All right. We're team laundry.
All right, chalk up a victory for team dishwasher. Okay, so question 5. What was special about the picture that Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen took of his wife's hand?
X-ray.
Nailed it.
Oh, Röntgen, yeah.
It was an X-ray picture of his wife's hand. In fact, the picture, you can see her wedding ring on it. So you see like the bones and like the wedding ring around her finger, which is really interesting.
Ooh.
So at the same World's Fair where X-rays were sort of like popularized and debuted, that was in the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. So there was an X-ray machine that was debuted there. That was also the World's Fair where ice cream cones and also fax machines were also debuted. I also want to say, I just realized that in my notes here, I have spelled fax machine FACTS and not FAX.
Yeah, I had to correct a
just
few
realized I was
instances of
wrong.
that myself. Yeah.
Wow.
So
Plus
ice
we
cream
had it.
cones, X-rays, and fax machines all go together.
Wait, you said
Fun.
1904 St. Louis?
St. Louis World's Fair.
Was that not also where the Olympics were in 1904?
I think so, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I think they were.
It's a solid year,
Big year
St.
for
Louis.
St. Louis. Damn.
Fun fact about the ice cream cone, it is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art as a humble masterpiece, something very simple that does its job very, very well.
Oh. I wouldn't really say that ice cream cones do a job very well. I don't think I've ever had an ice cream cone where my hands were completely sticky after that.
I'm a cup girl myself.
It's just more practical.
I'm a cone and a cup girl.
Ooh.
It's indulgent.
Have
but
you
it works.
seen the waffle cup?
The
Waffle cup
I
is
have, but I've not tried it.
It's perfect because you it melts in but you can chip off pieces of the edge and then you eat it. So it's zero waste but also way less mess.
What you really
All
want
right.
for ice cream is one of those taco salad shells. You know what I mean? Where you want it to be wide, where you can scoop with the rim of the cone. You don't want to worry about it falling out.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh my god. Ice cream cone chips could totally be a thing though.
Totally. Yeah.
Next World's Fair. We got it.
Don't tell anybody about it. We got to keep between us.
Cut this bit out.
Okay, so question 6. A 1927 demonstration of what technology prompted the New York Times to report, perhaps prematurely, commercial use in doubt?
27?
27.
Was this okay? That time period makes me think television.
I was going to say, it must be electrical.
Yeah, it was television.
Oh.
I'll tell you.
Wow.
You got it right. So
Is that Philo T. Farnsworth?
Well, he invented the television.
Okay,
yes.
but was it his display? Or was
Well,
it?
so I'll tell you that part. So that 1927 isn't the World's Fair part. The World's Fair part. So first of all, I just want to say the New York Times led. I think the headline said "commercial use in doubt," and it wasn't actually
That's a
the New York
whiff.
Times. Well, it wasn't actually the New York Times saying that. It was them quoting Bell Labs.
Oh,
Oh.
wow. Because that was the big Westinghouse thing, right? I think because this is actually from my fax machine episode 1 research. Because it was about the first recorded Olympics, and I looked into the first recorded anything, and humans didn't have enough contrast in your face, so we look like mannequins basically. So the first television show. It was like some like very high contrast makeup doll with like red lips.
Right. So the World's Fair part is that the day broadcast television was born is recounted as April 30th, 1939. And that is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivering the opening address at the New York World's Fair, which NBC broadcast the speech to homes all across the country for the very first time. So that is like held as the first broadcast television event. And it homes across the country just 12 years after the New York Times said it was commercial use was in doubt. Okay. So Coca-Cola in the early 80s wanted to introduce a new flavored Coke. So they had Coke, they had Diet Coke, and they wanted like the first flavored Coke. So they made a bunch of different flavors, and they basically offered them as like everyone who went to the 1982 World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee, Rob, which you have discussed with us. I'm not sure if in the podcast or out of the podcast yet, but at some point we'll see. So one of Rob's favorite World's Fair, the 1982 World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee. So my question to you is, what did fairgoers choose as their favorite flavor of Coke, which soon became the first flavored Coke?
Ooh.
Cherry?
There's cherry, there's vanilla.
Oh, vanilla.
Vanilla's later though, right?
Remember this, 1982.
I mean, and it's still Coke, right? It didn't like become Sprite or something. Like this flavor.
No, it's still
like a Coke.
Well, it's Coke brand plus the name of a flavor.
Oh, okay.
It's like flavor Coke or Coke flavor or something like that.
Oh, so did people do something ridiculous and it's like Coke strawberry? And it's just like some awful fruity drink? Because it was the 80s, like... This was the 1982...
Bad choices were made, yeah.
Like, you saw the commercial for the 1982 World's Fair. Crazy things are happening.
Yeah.
I think I'm leaning towards Coke Cherry because, I mean, it's been around for a long time. It's still popular. And considering that they tried multiple flavors... Like, it's possible that, like, that one emerged and, like, was clearly a good flavor and had staying power. Excuse me.
Staying powder.
Yeah. Had staying power. And maybe they revisited the other ones, like over
the
time.
Of a laxative.
Oh, no. But that is my reasoning.
I actually think this might be a famous kind of taste test failure where one taste was great, but then it was so bad that it never sold, and it is, like, Coke. Like vomit, but everyone was like, "Ooh, one sip was not bad."
Just Birdie Bot's Coke.
Yeah.
So one that we've never heard of.
That's kind of what I think, and that the answer is just a ridiculous flavor that will not make sense.
Okay.
Coke fried chicken.
Oh,
That might be good.
I kind of like it.
Coke hummus. Let's go.
I like those things together but separately.
Yeah, I might say
Coke hummus is nice.
I might say orange. That would be my guess.
Ooh.
Okay. I mean, I could see them trying that, so. All right.
So just to be clear, you're saying that Coke debuted Coke Orange. Orange Coke.
I think we might all be going in a different direction on this one.
Okay, so let's each of you choose what you think it is, and we'll do this individually.
Yeah.
Whoa.
You can say the same answer.
I say orange.
Splitting up the band. Okay,
Rob
I'll
says
cherry.
orange.
I'll
Emily
do cherry.
cherry.
Yeah.
I'll go cherry.
Okay. Rob, you have been voted off the podcast because it was cherry Coke.
Dang it. Okay.
You tried so hard to derail the cherry Coke.
But I didn't want to bring anyone down with me.
I mean,
So
they knew
noble.
better because
Yeah, they
even though
did.
even though you were trying to derail cherry Coke, you also countered with Coke vomit. So I'm glad that
This is a half-hearted effort, I
I'm
guess.
glad that Kristina and him were able to see through your lies. Okay, so final question 8. At the 1964 World's Fair in New York, also one we've discussed, there was a booth in which you could communicate with people at Disneyland in California using what technology?
AOL Instant Messenger.
I was gonna
I
say
would
like
say
a.
it is an improvement on AOL Instant Messenger
Is
in concept.
Is it like a? I'm imagining like a video chat, like a.
That is exactly right.
Oh.
Really?
Yes. In 1964, Bell Labs, which originally wasn't so keen on this moving picture image, 1964, Bell Labs introduced the picture phone, which allowed callers to basically, who were using a phone and then cameras hooked up, you could see who you were talking to on the phone, like on a video screen. So you could step into like an individual booth and video chat, Zoom, like we're doing right now.
Yeah, it's lost its novelty over time.
Which is pretty remarkable that in 1964 that had sort of been established.
That is
It took a while
insane.
for that to release.
Yeah.
Over phone
like it.
cables? I have a lot of questions actually about how that signal traveled.
I'll direct you to Bell Labs.
Yeah. I will Google that for myself later.
All right, that is our show. Thank you so much for listening. Kristina, it was wonderful to have you on this episode. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. This was the best.
You can check us out on social media at Facts Machine Pod and on Facebook at Facts Machine Podcast. And if you'd like to follow us, I'm at Arcs in Sciences. M.
At _EM Costa.
Rob.
At Sweatervest SCI.
And Kristina, where can our listeners find you on social media?
K Panda.
Cool. Is that on both Twitter and Instagram?
Ooh, K Panda on Instagram, KM Pars on Twitter.
Cool. All right. So check out Kristina. And also, if they wanted to find you in the real world, say if they wanted to go to one of your museum exhibits in the future when we can go to things again.
Yeah, come to the Jewish Museum on Museum Mile, the Upper East Side, or come hang out with me in the digital realm while quarantine is on.
Fax Machine is produced by Noah Giberson, M. Costa, and Ron Frawley, with editing by Noah Giberson. Our theme music is by Anthony Antonelli, and our logo was designed by Mike Zola. Thanks. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.